trainers came to the Apollo 12 crew one day and said, "We're going to teach you what you need to know when you get to the moon." They said, "We know. We're going to put up the flag, we're going to talk to the president, we're going to come home." The trainer said, "Yeah, that's what you think." Just 4 months after the first landing, Apollo 12 carries Pete Conrad, Richard Gordon, and Alan Bean to the moon. Alan Bean was a rookie astronaut, and Pete and Dick were Gemini veterans who are about as cool as they come. Everyone knew that they would be going to the moon, unlike Alan Bean. This was his first spaceflight. He had become an astronaut in 1963 with the third group of 14 astronauts, and he went immediately into the Apollo Applications Program, a space station that would eventually become Skylab. The original lunar module pilot for Apollo 12 was C.C. Williams. He was a superb astronaut who impressed everyone that he came into contact with. And Alan Bean, with C.C., like everybody else, like Don Isley on Apollo 7, Bill Anders Apollo 8, Rusty Schweiker Apollo 9, was all these guys that he used to say goodbye to as they got assigned to mission after mission. All these people from Al Bean's astronaut group, including C.C. Williams. But C.C. was killed when his T-38 went into his trainer aircraft. T-38 trainer aircraft went into a spin over the swamps of Tallahassee, and he was killed. So one day, Alan Bean was working in his office, and the doors opened, and as far as Al Bean describes it, a giant plume of light came in through these doors into this dark room, and Pete Conrad walks in, and he says, bursts in and comes straight out, "Hey Al, how would you like to go to the moon with Dick and me?" And Alan Bean just sits there and stares at him, absolutely flummoxed. and Pete just goes, "Al, you okay, Al?" And goes, "Okay, you're on board." Now, Al Bean is not so much, you say, typical of the astronaut persona. He's a lovely man, and not one of these great gruff kick-em-all test pilots that you usually see. He's a slightly more shy man, is Al Bean. But of course, even one point in Apollo 12, he even kind of saved the day. When the Saturn V ignited on November 14th, 1969, to take Pete, Dick and Al to the Ocean of Storms, their landing site in the moon, they ascended for about 30 seconds of trouble-free launch, and then all hell broke loose. In the command module, Pete Conrad was just settling in for the 12-minute ride into orbit when suddenly all of his panel readouts suddenly went blank, and he got about 10 or 12 warnings on his screen which he had to call out in very quick succession. And then the command module lost all primary power. So they went onto the backup systems to try and get her working again, and that failed. Going onto the backup systems failed. And the guidance guy, John Aaron, was sitting there, and everyone expected him, with a loss of power in that magnitude, to call a launch abort. But John Aaron, a year before, had learned about an innocuous little switch in the back of the command module that could solve the problem. He saw this pattern, and it had been 1 year since he had seen it, and he'd remembered it. And instead of everyone thinking him going to call launch abort, he said, "Flight, tell them to try SCE to aux, second condition electronics to auxiliary." And the flight controller, Jerry Griffin, turned to John Aaron and he said, "What?" But there was nothing else for them to do, so he turned to the Capcom Jerry Carr, and he said, "Okay, tell him SCE to aux." Jerry Carr looks up and he says, "What?" He says, "Tell him SCE to aux." He says, Apollo 12, try SCE to auxiliary. Pete Conrad immediately calls back down and he says, what? FCE to auxiliary? What the hell is that? It says, no, SCE to auxiliary. And Pete Conrad had no idea what the switch was. Dick Gordon was very quiet. One person did. Alan Bean had learned about the same switch at around about the same time as John Aaron, and he had remembered what it did. So he reached up over the back of his head using a little mirror, boom, a little switch, and the panels start to reactivate again because all of the technology, all of the electronics goes onto secondary systems. And so they continue on and they fix their platform when they get into orbit. And for the rest of their trip into orbit, Pete Conrad breaks out into nervous laughter. He laughed all the way into orbit. And just amazing. Observers on the ground later reported that not just one, but 2 bolts of lightning rode their exhaust trail right the way down to the pad and hit the tower. Apollo 12 had been hit by lightning and they still went to the moon. During transit there was a great amount of anticipation about the parachutes because they were wondering that if the lightning bolts had damaged the pyrotechnic system which would deploy the main chutes. But they finally decided that they'd be just as dead splashing down now as 10 days from now, so they might as well send them to the moon. Unlike Apollo 11, Conrad and Bean made a pinpoint landing. Their target had been waiting for them in the ocean of storms for 3 years. In 1966, NASA had launched an unmanned probe named Surveyor 3 to the ocean of storms. Apollo 12 crew wanted to go to the ocean of storms and retrieve a camera which had been mounted on Surveyor to take it back to Earth to study the effects of long-term spaceflight on man-made machines, as well as getting rock samples, which would be the primary objective for the up-and-coming lunar missions, getting ready for lunar missions to do geology on the moon. So Pete Conrad takes the controls of their lunar module Intrepid and moves it away from the command module Yankee Clipper, and they start to descend towards the Surveyor crater in the ocean of storms, and they made a perfect landing. And when they landed they yelled with each other with excitement, and then Pete Conrad says over, Al, you want to ask them? And he goes, yeah, sure. Push the button and he says, Houston Intrepid, go Intrepid, where are we? From all the crater sightings and delta vectors, it looked like Apollo 12 was right where they were supposed to be, less than 200 yards from the Surveyor probe, just like Pete said he would do. So their first EVA, their first spacewalk on the moon, they got out and immediately started doing core samples, drilling into the lunar surface to retrieve core samples. So it's a 4-hour spacewalk, and things start to go wrong for Al Bean quite quickly. His first job was to deploy the television camera, which will allow audiences at home to watch them while they're on the moon in stunning high-definition colour, unlike the black and white unit Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had at the Sea of Tranquility. And it would have been amazing had Al Bean not done something a little stupid. He took the camera off of the LEM and hoisted it over his shoulder and started walking with it towards where he was supposed to set it up so that the world could watch them work. And as he had it over his shoulder, he was supposed to remember where the sun was in the sky. And he didn't do that, turned it round so that it faced directly into the sun, and he completely burned out the Vidicom tube. It was completely fried. And less than 20 minutes into the spacewalk, colour TV from the Ocean of Storms ended. And that was the last the world saw of Apollo 12 walking on the moon, other than still photography. But you have to carry on. So, they did their stuff, they dug their trenches, and that was primarily the objective for the first spacewalk. And then, 4 hours after the start, they climbed back inside the LEM and had a sleep before they got ready to go out and do their second EVA. Now, sleeping in a lunar module is not something that you really want to have to do, because it's a noisy thing. It really is. There are fans and readouts and displays and beeps and boops that happen all the time, and it's a really difficult thing to sleep in, especially with these big suits. And actually, while Pete Conrad was sleeping, the lace in his boot caught and it pulled his suit over to one side, and the neck ring cut into his neck, and that was a great problem. That caused Pete Conrad to lose a lot of sleep until eventually he noticed Al Bean had woken up and asked him to relace his boot, which is a big predicament when you're in a tiny little LEM and laces that go all the way up your leg. So anyway, they got as much rest as they could and then got out again and started work again around the lunar module. And this is where they had these cuff checklists, which were right here, because your watch is up here and the link for your glove is down here. So the best place for this checklist to be is on your arm, and this helps them remember the huge amount of things that they have to do while they're on the lunar surface. And as they're working, Al Bean flips the page and comes across this Playboy bunny, this girl here, and it said underneath, "Observe the protuberances." They tried to use geological terms as much as possible, and so Al Bean had no idea this was going to be in here. This is the work of their backup crew, Dave Scott, Jim Irwin, and Al Warden, who put these checklists together without the prime crew ever seeing them. So he flips the page and here's this Playboy bunny in his thing. And he ran over to Pete, tapped him on the shoulder and looked at it, but he didn't say a word over the air because he knew there would be some little old lady who wouldn't like the fact that their tax dollars had sent Playboy bunnies up to the moon. And Pete and Al laughed with each other. It was real good. And they both flipped over, and sure enough, there were a few more in there. So, just trying to keep a little levity, keeping things light on the part of the backup crew. So, off they went. They started down towards Surveyor, the probe where they would retrieve this camera. And getting it would mean that Apollo 12 had completed each and every one of their mission objectives. So they got the wire cutters and cut the thing off and hoisted it back to the LEM. They wanted to take a picture of both astronauts in the same frame, because on Apollo 11 it had just been Buzz taken by Neil. They brought with them a little timer that would be fitted into it, and the result would have been magnificent had Al Bean been able to find the damn thing. So it's a little bit sad that they had to go back without this picture of the two of them together beside Surveyor. And with that, the second of their 2 4-hour moonwalks was over, and then 12 blasted off, come home. And with their successful mission, paves the way for fellow astronauts to embark on much more advanced lunar exploration. The camera that they took back wields a remarkable discovery. Bacteria on Earth seem to have survived in the vacuum of space. Just an amazing discovery. Al Bean said that he always thought that their crew, Apollo 12, could have flown any mission as good as anybody else, probably. Except 13.